William Penny signed the movement order for Operation Grapple on April 1, 1957, in a room off Whitehall, and then flew to Christmas Island via San Francisco with a briefcase of yield calculations he did not fully trust. Penny was 57, a mathematician who had watched Nagasaki from a B-29 in August 1945, and the man Attlee had quietly appointed in 1947 to give Britain her own bomb. By spring 1957, he was running the most expensive scientific project in British history on a coral atoll 4,000 miles from the nearest British dockyard, with the Prime Minister demanding a thermonuclear device before the Americans and Soviets agreed a test ban that would freeze London out of the superpower club forever. The atoll itself, Kiritimati, had been annexed by Britain in 1888 and forgotten. Now it held 3,000 servicemen, a hastily lengthened runway of pierced steel planking, and a task force under Air Vice Marshal Wilfred Oulton. Vickers Valiants of 49 squadrons sat under palm thatch revetments, each aircraft modified with a heat-reflective white finish, and a bomb bay cleared for a device weighing over 4 tons. The device was called Short Granite. On paper, it was a 2-stage thermonuclear weapon of the Teller Ulam type. In practice, Aldermaston's physicists had never tested a working hydrogen bomb, had no access to American design data since the Macmillan Act of 1946, and were working from a theoretical concept sketched in 1954 by Keith Roberts and John Corner on graph paper. Harold Macmillan had inherited the program from Eden in January 1957 and understood exactly what was at stake. His diary entry for February 5th recorded the calculation with characteristic dryness. Without a megaton weapon, Britain could not credibly threaten Moscow, and without that threat, the Americans would treat her as they treated France. On May 15th, Valiant XD-818, captained by Wing Commander Kenneth Hubbard, released Short Granite from 45,000 feet over Malden Island, 400 miles south of the base. The flash reached the aircraft in seconds. The fireball climbed to 57,000 feet. The yield was measured at approximately 300 kilotons. 300 kilotons was a catastrophe. The design had been calculated to produce close to a megaton. The secondary stage had failed to ignite properly, and what the Valiant had dropped was, in strict physics terms, a large fission weapon boosted by a small thermonuclear component, rather than a true hydrogen bomb. Penny knew it. The scientific staff at Christmas Island knew it. The pilots did not, and the Ministry of Supply press release drafted in London on May 16th did not mention the shortfall. The political imperative overrode the physics. On the same afternoon, Macmillan cabled Washington that Britain had joined the thermonuclear club. The Foreign Office briefed friendly correspondents. Aneurin Bevan, who had abandoned unilateralism at Brighton the previous October, with his line about sending a British Foreign Secretary naked into the conference chamber, offered guarded approval from the opposition front bench. The public was told Britain had a hydrogen bomb. At Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, the Analysts of Strategic Air Command's Intelligence Division looked at the seismic traces, the airburst signatures collected by WB-50 sampling aircraft flown out of Hickam, and the radiochemistry from filter paper recovered off Johnston Island. The numbers did not describe a hydrogen bomb. They described something odd, a device with a fission yield too large for a pure fission weapon and a fusion signature too small for a proper thermonuclear one. The Americans could not classify what Britain had actually detonated, nor could they explain, given the Macmillan Act, how Aldermaston had built it at all. The Macmillan Act had been the wound Attlee could never quite close. On August 1st, 1946, Truman signed the Atomic Energy Act into law, and every clause of technical cooperation written into the Quebec Agreement of August 1943 became legally void. Britain had contributed uranium research, the Tube Alloys team, physicists including James Chadwick and Rudolph Piles, and industrial capacity to the Manhattan Project. In return, she received, from the moment Truman's pen lifted, nothing. The 1946 Act made it a felony for any American official to share nuclear weapons information with a foreign power, including the ally that had helped design the weapons in the first place. Attlee's cabinet met to consider the implications on January 8, 1947, in a committee designated GEN 163. The record released by the National Archives in 1976 shows 6 ministers present: Attlee, Bevin, Morrison, Addison, Alexander, and Wilmot. Cripps and Dalton, the Chancellor and the President of the Board of Trade, were excluded because their opposition on grounds of cost was expected. Bevin, the Foreign Secretary, arrived late from a meeting with the American ambassador and delivered the sentence that Peter Hennessy has reconstructed from 3 separate witnesses. "We've got to have this thing over here, whatever it costs." He added that he was not having any foreign secretary of his talked to by an American Secretary of State in the manner Burns had just used with him. The decision was taken that afternoon. Britain would build an atomic bomb. The program would be concealed inside the Ministry of Supply budget under the heading of High Explosive Research, would report to Attlee alone, and would be run by Penny from a new facility at Fort Halstead in Kent, later transferred to Aldermaston in Berkshire. Parliament was not told. The Labour backbenches were not told. The full cabinet was not told until 1948, and even then in language that concealed the scale of the commitment. The first British atomic device detonated in the lagoon at Montebello off Western Australia on October 3, 1952, inside the frigate HMS Plym. Penny was on board the observation vessel HMS Campania. The yield was measured at 25 kilotons, close to Nagasaki. Churchill, back at number 10 since October 1951, sent Penny a knighthood in the coronation honours. The Americans responded by testing Ivy Mike in the Marshall Islands on November 1, 1952. Its yield was 10.4 megatons. Britain had spent 5 years and £150 million to produce a weapon her principal ally had already made obsolete. The strategic logic tightened rapidly. On December 8, 1953, Eisenhower delivered his Atoms for Peace speech at the United Nations. On March 1, 1954, the Castle Bravo test at Bikini yielded 15 megatons, 3 times the predicted output, and contaminated the Japanese fishing vessel Daigo Fukuryumaru. The public shock across the Commonwealth was severe. Within weeks, Churchill was writing to Eisenhower asking for a resumption of nuclear cooperation. Eisenhower's reply, drafted by John Foster Dulles, was polite and empty. By July 1954, Churchill had convened a cabinet committee designated GEN 464 and secured agreement in principle for a British hydrogen bomb. Eden inherited the decision in April 1955. The Defence White Paper of February 1955 committed Britain publicly to a thermonuclear weapon. The V-Force was already flying. Valiants had entered service with 138 Squadron at RAF Gaydon in January 1955. Vulcans and Victors were in development. What remained was the physics, and the physics in the summer of 1955 did not yet exist on paper in a form Aldermaston could build. Aldermaston in 1955 was a former airfield in Berkshire, converted into laboratories by contractors working from Nissen huts. The staff numbered about 4,000. The theoretical physics division was led by Corner, a Cambridge-trained mathematician who had spent the war on shaped charge research at Fort Halstead. His deputy Roberts had been recruited from Imperial College in 1954, specifically to work on thermonuclear design. Between them, they had access to the open scientific literature, the declassified portions of the Smith Report from 1945, and rumours brought back by British physicists who had attended Geneva conferences. They did not have the Teller Ulam paper or any American document describing how a fusion secondary was compressed and ignited by radiation from a fission primary. The essential insight that a fission bomb's X-rays could be channeled to compress a separate fusion capsule before the blast wave arrived was arrived at independently at Aldermaston during 1954 and early 1955, Corner and Roberts wrote it up in a paper circulated internally in April 1955, and to a very small group at the Ministry of Supply. Penny reviewed it and approved development on the basis that the concept was sound but untested. The problem was engineering. 3 designs went forward. Short granite was the pure 2-stage device tested on May 15, 1957. Orange Herald was a boosted fission weapon of very large size, essentially a Nagasaki-type device scaled up with tritium boosting. Purple granite was a variant thermonuclear design. All 3 were to be dropped from Valiants at Malden Island as part of Operation Grapple. The plan, agreed by Macmillan on March 7, 1957, was to test all 3 and select whichever produced the highest yield closest to a megaton, then declare victory. Short granite produced 300 kilotons on May 15th. Orange Herald, dropped on May 31st by squadron leader Dave Roberts flying Valiant XD-822, produced 720 kilotons. This was the largest pure fission device ever detonated by any country, before or since. It used a very large quantity of highly enriched uranium and would have been impossibly expensive to stockpile. Purple granite, dropped on June 19th, produced only 150 kilotons. None of the 3 was a true hydrogen bomb by the American technical definition. Macmillan's cabinet was informed of the true results in a memorandum from the Minister of Defence, Duncan Sandys, dated June 24, 1957. The document TNA reference CAB130/122 records the political conclusion in a single paragraph. The public would be told the tests had succeeded. The Americans would be encouraged in that belief. Development of a genuine 2-stage thermonuclear weapon would proceed at maximum priority with a target completion date of spring 1958. The deception was to be maintained for as long as required. At Offutt, Strategic Air Command's Foreign Technology Division under Colonel Doyle Northrop was assembling the intelligence picture. Sampling data from WB-50S of the 55th Weather Reconnaissance Squadron indicated a fusion signature far below what a genuine 2-stage device would produce. The seismic and acoustic data suggested a total yield in the low hundreds of kilotons, rather than the megaton class. The radiochemistry, which measured specific isotope ratios from the debris cloud, showed a fission fraction close to 100% for the second test. Northrop's team wrote a preliminary assessment in July 1957, concluding that Britain had not in fact detonated a hydrogen bomb. The assessment was classified and circulated only within the United States Air Force. It was not shared with the White House. It was not shared with the British. Sputnik launched on October 4, 1957, and rearranged every assumption in Washington. A Soviet R-7 rocket capable of putting an 83-kilogram satellite into orbit could also in principle deliver a thermonuclear warhead to New York. The technical superiority the Americans had assumed since Hiroshima had, in a single evening, become uncertain. Congressional hearings began within a week. The Geither report, delivered to Eisenhower on November 7th, warned of a bomber gap and a missile gap, and called for a massive expansion of Strategic Air Command. In this climate, the McMahon Act suddenly looked less like a legal firewall and more like a strategic handicap. Macmillan understood the opening immediately. On October 22nd, he flew to Washington for a summit with Eisenhower at the White House. The British delegation included Selwyn Lloyd from the Foreign Office and Sir Frederick Brundrett, the chief scientific advisor at the Ministry of Defence. The American side included Dulles, the Atomic Energy Commission chairman Lewis Strauss, and John McCone. Macmillan's brief, drafted by the Cabinet Office and preserved at Kew as PREM 11/2-554, argued for the restoration of full nuclear cooperation on the grounds that Britain was already a thermonuclear power, and continued Anglo-American separation weakened the Western alliance in the face of Soviet advances. The claim of thermonuclear parity was central. If Britain had not detonated a hydrogen bomb in May, the case for repeal of the McMahon Act's restrictions was much weaker. Macmillan knew what Aldermaston had actually achieved. He knew what Grapple had actually yielded. He did not raise these details with Eisenhower, and Eisenhower did not raise them either. The intelligence assessment from Northrop's team at Offutt remained confined to the United States Air Force. The Central Intelligence Agency's own assessment, produced by the Office of Scientific Intelligence, was more cautious and noted anomalies without definitive conclusions. The White House had not been briefed to a level that would have forced Eisenhower to challenge Macmillan's premise. The summit communiqué of October 25, 1957, announced the formation of a Committee on Nuclear Cooperation. Eisenhower committed to seeking amendment of the McMahon Act. The Declaration of Common Purpose, drafted by Sir Norman Brooke, the Cabinet Secretary, contained the operative sentence. The concept of national self-sufficiency was out of date. Congressional action followed quickly. On June 30, 1958, the amendments to the Atomic Energy Act passed both houses. On July 3, 1958, the US-UK Mutual Defence Agreement was signed in Washington by Dulles and Lord Hood, the British Chargé d'Affaires. The agreement's terms were extraordinary. It permitted the exchange of classified nuclear weapons design information, fissile materials, and delivery system technology. Aldermaston received, over the following 18 months, sufficient American technical data to complete a genuine two-stage thermonuclear weapon. The device tested as Grapple X on November 8, 1957 at Christmas Island, and Grapple Y on April 28, 1958, drew increasingly on this partial cooperation, though the crucial 1958 agreement had not yet been signed. Grapple Y produced approximately 3 megatons and was, by any technical definition, a true hydrogen bomb. Britain had achieved thermonuclear capability. She had also secured the American cooperation the agreement guaranteed by claiming she already possessed it. Within Whitehall, the deception was regarded as a legitimate act of statecraft. Sir Frederick Brundrett wrote in a private minute in July 1958 that the country had recovered in 18 months a position it might otherwise have lost for a generation. The Americans, when they eventually realized the sequence of events, chose not to reopen the question. The Mutual Defense Agreement was too valuable to both sides to risk on retrospective accounting. The V-Force was the platform that made the deception credible. Without a bomber capable of reaching Moscow with a thermonuclear payload, no claim of British nuclear capability would have carried strategic weight. The Air Ministry's Operational Requirement B.35/46, issued in 1946, had specified a jet bomber capable of delivering a 10,000-pound weapon at 500 knots at 50,000 feet, with a range of 3,350 nautical miles. 3 aircraft were ordered against this requirement to spread industrial risk: the Vickers Valiant, the Avro Vulcan, and the Handley Page Victor. All 3 flew during the 1950s. The result was the V-Force, which by 1961 comprised 144 aircraft at 10 stations across eastern England. The Valiant entered service first in January 1955, with 138th Squadron at RAF Gaydon. It was the least capable of the 3 but the most conventional in design, and thus the fastest to develop. Vulcans entered service with 83 Squadron at RAF Waddington in July 1957. Victors followed with 10 Squadron at RAF Cottesmore in April 1958. The stations were dispersed to reduce vulnerability to Soviet first strike. Waddington, Scampton, Coningsby, Finningley, Cottesmore, Marham, Wittering, Whiten, Honington, Gaydon. Aircraft were held on quick reaction alert with crews sleeping in dispersal huts alongside their aircraft. From alert order, the target time to be airborne was 4 minutes. Bomber Command's Commander-in-Chief through the critical years was Sir Harry Broadhurst, succeeded in 1959 by Sir Kenneth Cross. The war plans were held at High Wycombe under the codename Bulldog, revised annually against the Joint Intelligence Committee's assessment of Soviet target priorities. By 1961, the plan allocated V-Force aircraft against 48 Soviet cities, 20 airfields, and a small number of specific military headquarters. The targeting was coordinated with Strategic Air Command under the arrangements established at the Nassau Conference of 1962, though the British retained an independent capability to fire on national authority. The weapons themselves progressed in step with the delivery platforms. Blue Danube, the first British atomic bomb, entered service in November 1953 and was carried initially by Canberras before transferring to Valiants. Yellow Sun Mark I, a megaton-class weapon based on the Greengrass warhead derived from Orange Herald, entered service in 1958. Yellow Sun Mark II, using the true thermonuclear Red Snow warhead, developed from American design data under the 1958 agreement, entered service in 1961. The transition through these three generations of weapon, in less than a decade, was a considerable industrial achievement financed at severe cost to conventional defense expenditure. The Sandys White Paper of April 1957, published 3 weeks before the Grapple test at Malden Island, made the strategic logic explicit. Manned aircraft were declared obsolescent and the future of British air defence was placed in missiles. The RAF fighter force was to be run down. The Territorial Army was to be reduced. National service was to end by 1960. In exchange, the country would maintain a strategic nuclear deterrent capable of imposing unacceptable damage on the Soviet Union. Dennis Healey from the Labour front bench called it a defence policy that would leave Britain naked against everything except total war. Sandys accepted the characterisation. The V-Force reached its peak strength in 1964. Blue Steel, a rocket-powered standoff missile with a Red Snow warhead, entered service with 617 Squadron at RAF Scampton in September 1962. The missile had a range of 100 nautical miles and allowed Vulcans to launch outside the effective envelope of Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missiles. It was the high point of the independent British bomber deterrent. Within 4 years, the strategic role would pass to the Royal Navy, and the Vulcans would be reassigned to NATO's tactical strike role in Germany. Blue Streak was the failure that forced the transition. The intermediate-range ballistic missile program had begun in 1955 as the intended successor to the V-Force. It was designed to carry a Red Snow warhead over 2,500 nautical miles from silos in eastern England to targets in western Russia. De Havilland Propellers was the prime contractor. The engines were developed by Rolls-Royce and Rocketdyne. By 1959, the estimated development cost had risen to £550 million, and the operational problems were becoming clear. Fixed silos, whose locations Soviet intelligence would inevitably identify, were vulnerable to a first strike. The missile itself, using liquid oxygen and kerosene fuel, took 30 minutes to prepare for launch. In a bolt from the blue scenario, the entire force could be destroyed before firing. The Chiefs of Staff Committee reviewed the program in November 1959. The Vice Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Charles Elworthy, presented an assessment that Blue Streak was strategically obsolete before entering service. The Defence Board endorsed cancellation on February 24, 1960. Macmillan announced the decision in the Commons on April 13th, offering the American Skybolt air-launched ballistic missile as the replacement. Skybolt would be carried by Vulcans, extending the useful life of the V-Force into the 1970s. The program, developed by Douglas Aircraft for the United States Air Force, appeared to solve every British problem at modest cost. Skybolt was cancelled by Robert McNamara on November 7, 1962. The decision was taken on grounds of American cost and technical performance, without prior consultation with London. Peter Thornycroft, the Defence Secretary, received the news through the British Defence Staff in Washington. Macmillan learned of it the same evening. The political damage was severe. The V-Force without Skybolt would be obsolete within 5 years. There was no British successor available. The Labour opposition under Hugh Gaitskell had already committed to abandoning the independent deterrent. Without an American replacement, the deterrent would end. The Nassau Conference of December 18th to 21st, 1962 was arranged at short notice. Macmillan flew to the Bahamas with Thornycroft and Sir Solly Zuckerman, the chief scientific advisor. Kennedy arrived from Washington with McNamara, Dean Rusk and McGeorge Bundy. The opening American position was to offer Britain the Hound Dog cruise missile, technically inferior and politically insulting. Macmillan refused. The conference then debated Polaris, the American submarine-launched ballistic missile that Kennedy's administration had prioritized over Skybolt in the first place. Macmillan's argument, recorded in the cabinet minutes and reconstructed in Hennessy's account, rested on the memory of Suez in 1956 and the earlier abandonment during the McMahon Act years. Britain had contributed to the alliance for a generation and expected reciprocity. Kennedy, according to the American record, was moved less by the argument than by the political consequences of a public rupture with London. On December 21st, the Nassau Agreement was signed. Britain would purchase Polaris missiles at the American procurement price, would build her own submarines and warheads, and would assign the force to NATO except when supreme national interests were at stake. The Polaris sales agreement of April 6, 1963 formalized the arrangement. 4 Resolution-class submarines were ordered from Vickers at Barrow and Camel Laird at Birkenhead. HMS Resolution commissioned on October 2, 1967. The transition from air-delivered to submarine-launched Deterrent was complete by June 1969, when the Royal Navy formally assumed responsibility for the strategic deterrent from Bomber Command. The V-Force had lasted 11 years in its strategic role. Its successors would remain at sea, 1 submarine always on patrol, for the remainder of the Cold War and beyond. The intelligence dimension shadowed every technical decision. GCHQ at Cheltenham, moved from Eastcote in 1952, was the largest signals intelligence organization in Europe and worked in continuous partnership with the American National Security Agency under the UK-USA Agreement of March 1946. That partnership was severely tested by the Klaus Fuchs case, in which the German-born physicist who had worked at Los Alamos and later at Harwell was arrested on February 2, 1950, and confessed to passing atomic weapons information to Soviet intelligence over 9 years. Fuchs was sentenced to 14 years at the Old Bailey on March 1, 1950. The damage to Anglo-American trust was immediate and lasting. The McMahon Act had preceded Fuchs by 4 years, but the case gave American opponents of nuclear cooperation with Britain their most powerful argument. Every subsequent British request for shared technology had to be weighed against the possibility that British security would fail again. Bruno Pontecorvo, an Italian-born physicist who had worked at Harwell, defected to the Soviet Union in September 1950 with his family. The Pontecorvo case reinforced American concerns. The Cambridge network, whose full extent would not emerge for years, was already active. Donald Maclean, first secretary at the British Embassy in Washington from 1944 to 1948, had access to combined policy committee papers on atomic energy throughout the crucial period. Maclean's exposure came through Venona, the American cryptanalytic project that had begun reading fragments of wartime Soviet cables in 1946. GCHQ was formally admitted to Venona in 1948. The identification of Maclean as the source codenamed Homer was completed by early 1951. Guy Burgess and Maclean fled to Moscow on May 25, 1951. Kim Philby, who had been serving as MI6 liaison to the CIA in Washington from 1949, came under immediate suspicion and was recalled to London. He was cleared by Harold Macmillan, then Foreign Secretary, in a common statement on November 7, 1955, and finally defected to Moscow on January 23, 1963. The Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired through much of this period by Sir Patrick Riley and later by Sir Bernard Burroughs, produced the assessments that informed cabinet nuclear decisions. Its output during the Grapple period included estimates of Soviet thermonuclear progress, of American willingness to resume cooperation, and of the political consequences within the Commonwealth of a British test failure. The JIC assessments were shared in carefully controlled form with the Prime Minister and a small group of cabinet ministers. They were not shared with Parliament, which throughout the 1950s received only sanitised summaries in the Defence White Papers. The committee's judgment on the Grapple series was that a public claim of thermonuclear success would be accepted in the United States provided the technical data was not challenged. The JIC noted that American radiochemistry would eventually produce a definitive answer, but assessed that the political incentive to acknowledge such an answer would be weak once the Mutual Defense Agreement was in place. This assessment proved accurate. The Northrop reporter offer was never elevated to presidential attention. The CIA's more cautious assessment was overtaken by the 1958 agreement. By 1959, the question of what Britain had actually detonated in 1957 had become historically interesting rather than politically live. MI5 continued to investigate atomic security throughout the period. Sir Roger Hollis, Director General from 1956 to 1965, oversaw the vetting of Aldermaston personnel and the physical security of the weapons stockpile. Hollis himself would later be accused, on evidence historians, including Christopher Andrew, have found unpersuasive of being a Soviet agent. The suspicion, whatever its merits, illustrated the atmosphere in which British nuclear decisions were taken. Trust in any direction, whether across the Atlantic or across Whitehall, could not be assumed. Cheveline was the final chapter of the story that began at Malden Island. By the mid-1960s, the Soviet Union had deployed the Galosh anti-ballistic missile system around Moscow. Polaris warheads on their standard American configuration. 3 W-58 physics packages per missile with limited penetration aids were assessed by the chief scientific advisor, Sir Solly Zuckerman, and later Sir Herman Bondi, as increasingly likely to be intercepted before reaching the target city. The Moscow criterion, the requirement that a British deterrent must be able to destroy the Soviet capital, was in question. The Wilson government initiated studies in 1967 under the codename Antelope. The Heath government continued the work as Super Antelope from 1970. The program was renamed Cheveline in November 1973 and formally approved in January 1975 by Wilson's returned government. The decision was taken by an inner group of cabinet ministers, including James Callaghan as Foreign Secretary, Dennis Healey as Chancellor, and Roy Mason as Defence Secretary. The full cabinet was not consulted. Parliament was not informed of the programme's existence until Francis Pym made a statement on January 24, 1980. Cheveline replaced the Polaris front end with a British-designed system that could deploy multiple warheads and decoys to saturate Galosh interceptors. The Aldermaston and Foulness work required a decade and cost approximately £1 billion. The programme was one of the most closely held secrets in British defence during the 1970s. Callaghan's government commissioned a study in 1978, led by Sir Anthony Duff and Ronald Mason, on options for a Polaris successor. The Duff-Mason report, delivered in December 1978, recommended Trident. Thatcher took the decision on July 15, 1980. The choice was Trident C4 initially, upgraded to Trident D5 in March 1982. The submarines would be 4 Vanguard-class boats built by Vickers at Barrow. The warheads would be British-designed but drew heavily on American data. The cost over the life of the programme was projected at £5 billion and rose considerably higher. Michael Foot's Labour Party fought the 1983 general election on a platform of unilateral nuclear disarmament and lost by 144 seats. Neil Kinnock maintained the policy through 1987 and lost again. By 1989, Labour had abandoned unilateralism. The consensus that had held since 1947, that Britain must possess an independent deterrent, was fully restored across both parties. The Cold War ended on Britain's terms in the specific sense that the strategic doctrine adopted in 1947 was validated by outcome. Attlee's cabinet had chosen a national deterrent because it did not trust the American guarantee to be permanent. The decision cost the country perhaps 2% of gross national product for 4 decades. It bought a seat at every superpower conference from the Test Ban Treaty of 1963 through Reykjavik in October 1986 and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of December 1987. Thatcher's relationship with Reagan and her role as interpreter of Gorbachev to the West from December 1984 rested on the underlying reality that Britain held nuclear weapons that could reach Moscow. Penny died at his home in East Hendred on March 3, 1991, 10 months before the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 26, 1991. The obituaries described him as the father of the British bomb. What they did not describe, because the files remained closed, was the moment at Malden Island in May 1957, when the physics fell short of the requirement and the political decision was taken to conceal the shortfall. The full scientific record of the Grapple series was released by the National Archives in stages between 1998 and 2003. The Americans, when the documents were reviewed at Los Alamos and at the Naval Historical Center, reached the conclusion Northrup's team had reached in the summer of 1957. Britain had not detonated a hydrogen bomb on May 15, 1957. She had detonated one 11 months later, on April 28, 1958. With quiet assistance, the Americans had agreed to give her because she had persuaded them she did not need it.